Good morning, everyone. I'm Morton Blackwell, president of the Leadership Institute, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our Wednesday Wake Up Club breakfast for June. We live in interesting times. If you followed the news last night and this morning, you will see something like the headline in the Washington Times this morning: House rejects, quote, clean debt limit ceiling hike, 318 to 97. And 81 Democrats voted with all of the Republicans against what President Obama challenged the Congress to vote on. And it is extremely interesting, and it may be that the American public is ready to make serious changes which to propose in earlier times might have been political suicide, and the whole tenor of discussion has changed. And I give you a piece of evidence from House Minority Whip Steny Hoyer, who said the House ought to vote for this, though he said he was voting against it because it would give ammunition to Republicans in next year's elections. This is what Steny Hoyer said. Quote, "This is not an honest debate. This is not an honest proposal. If we vote for it, ho ho, guess what? You're for raising the debt limit without any fiscal discipline." Isn't that sweet? In 2011, the Leadership Institute has already trained 5,032 students, and since 1979, the Institute has trained over 94,805 people. You have before you on the tables a copy of the schedule of our currently scheduled schools for the year. There will be many others scheduled as the year goes along. I invite you to take a moment to review our upcoming schools and consider attending one or sending a friend to one of our programs. Now, it is now my pleasure to introduce Megan Swella. She will offer an invocation for us and lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. Megan is the Youth Leadership School coordinator, and she's responsible for recruiting and running the Youth Leadership School, which is our flagship school, all across the country. She is originally from Yucca Valley, California, and is a graduate of Central College in Pella, Iowa. Question: who knows what Pella is? What's the origin of Pella is? P-E-L-L-A. Pella. What's the origin of that? It was the capital of Macedonia under Philip and Alexander the Great. Megan?
Good morning. If bow your head for a word of prayer. Our gracious Heavenly Father, I thank you so much for this morning. We come to you with reverent and humble hearts and just ask for your blessing on this morning's gathering and on our speaker, and ask your continued blessing on this great nation that we all love. In your name, amen. And if you would stand, flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, liberty and justice for all.
Now I present to you Brennan Ward, who will give us a report on the Leadership Institute's Grassroots program. Brennan is the Grassroots coordinator for the Leadership Institute. He travels all over the nation training conservative activists. Originally from New Hampshire, Brennan received a bachelor's degree from the University of New Hampshire which is, by the way, a beautiful campus, and a master's degree from George Washington University's School of Political Management.
Well, good morning. Morning. Well, the way I describe the grassroots department, I'm assuming there's a lot of baseball fans here. We're like the away team. I just think Morton wants to get rid of us, but that's just me. So we are really excited to report. We actually have a great year ahead of us. We're actually at the height of what I consider a presidential year, even though we're in 2011. There's a lot of eager conservative students who are looking for training all across the country. And just to give you a basic guideline, as of date, we've done 43 programs, trained over 1,800 students, again, outside the building, where people have come to us and we've reached out to other conservative groups and said, hey, we want to get trained, we want to win, we want to get better, and we're here to make sure that happens. Also, we have another additional 34 programs being planned. Keep coming to these wonderful breakfasts because that number is only getting higher. We have people almost on a daily basis who say they want training all around the country. As far as around the country where we work, 17 states, including D.C. And another thing exciting going on this year is we are partnering up, and all the details are getting worked out with the Tea Party Patriots. And again, all the details are getting undone, but they plan to do 2 trainings in each state, which again is like another additional 100 trainings, which would really make this a banner year for the grassroots department. We also, as far as another initiative we've really taken a hold of and ownership of, is our applied student training, where what we'll do is we'll go out and train people for a day on a Saturday. And then we will basically set up a curriculum where it's a hands-on, applied, practical approach, which allows students to take the information they learn from our wonderful guest faculty and myself and some other coordinators, and basically really apply it. As a student going through grad school and UNH, as Morton said, I always took a better understanding, a better grasp of a lot of this material when it was applied. When we, there was a project where you had to take what you learned and apply it to something, and ultimately to winning. And well, that's about it. But again, stay tuned. We're gonna have a really, really great year, and I'm really excited.
Thank you very much. Well, you may think that I'm just trying to get you all out of here. It's a good experience doing field work. In my years working for the College Republicans, where I was executive director off and on for 5.5 years of the national organization and working in various campaigns, I worked recruitment tables on 312 different college Republican campuses, so I know what field work is about, and one can survive it and even thrive. And now, our Vice President David Fenner is going to come and introduce our speaker. David is known to many of you. He came to us from the Council for National Policy, where I hired him many years ago. Then I left for in the year 2000, and some years, just a couple of years ago, David, who had worked his way through law school, came to me and asked me if I would write him a letter of recommendation so he might get on with some conservative law firm. And I said, David, I would be delighted to write you a fine letter of introduction, but I have something else to discuss with you. And David became our Vice President for Programs, where he is doing an excellent job. David?
Thank you, Morton. Good morning. It's my pleasure this morning to introduce our speaker. Mr. Doug Bandow is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute. He specializes in foreign policy and civil liberties. He worked as a special assistant to President Reagan and editor of the political magazine Inquiry. He writes regularly for leading publications such as Fortune magazine, National Interest, Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Times. Mr. Bandow speaks frequently at academic conferences, on college campuses, and to business groups. Mr. Bandow has been a regular commentator on ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, Fox News Channel, and even MSNBC. I'm not sure whether or not to congratulate you on that. He holds a JD from Stanford University, and the topic he will be presenting on this morning is titled America Bankrupt and Osama bin Laden Dead, Time to Return to the Foreign Policy of a Republic. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker this morning. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Doug Bandow. Thank you.
I see I'm not the only non-practicing lawyer involved in politics. Thank you, David. And it's always a pleasure to see Morton and Helen again. Morton I met back when I came to Washington with the Reagan Revolution too many years ago, I'm afraid, but it certainly brings back very fond memories, especially when one looks at what we're dealing with in today's world. We certainly do live in interesting times, both domestic politics as well as around the world, and I want to focus a bit more around the world. You know, foreign policy has a way of intruding even on politics when everybody wants to focus on domestic policy. I mean, I think of President Clinton who ran, or Bill Clinton who ran on the mantra, it's the economy, stupid, and found himself off in a war in the Balkans and all sorts of other things. I think President Obama thought he was going to have a domestic revolution and wanted to focus on that. Now we find him starting his own war over in North Africa and involved in other conflicts. That it's very hard to get away from international issues. And the U.S., I think, kind of naturally gets involved because we've been called the unipower, the sole superpower, kind of a hegemon that imposes itself upon the rest of the world. So Washington, I kind of say it's akin to Scripture, where God, is concerned even when a sparrow falls to earth. Policymakers in Washington seem concerned, about anything that happens around the world, no matter how distant, no matter how small. So the question of who rules a small country on North Africa suddenly becomes a major question in Washington, and a major question in Brussels, and a major question elsewhere where the U.S. is involved. And I think we can appropriately celebrate the death of bin Laden. I think the question is, what does that suggest something for us in the coming years? We found there's a challenge of being a superpower. I think it's important to reflect on America's heritage in this way. The U.S., of course, started out as a continental republic. The early Americans wanted a strong America. It's one of the reasons they gave up the Articles of Confederation and moved to the Constitution, was they wanted to be able to protect the United States in a world of imperial powers. But they were also quite clear they didn't want us mucking around in imperial business. I mean, the famous, final words of George Washington, avoid permanent entanglements. I mean, he looked at Europe and all these people constantly at war. Have commercial relationships with them, have temporary alliances when it serves your interest, but be very careful of these permanent entanglements, because one of the problems for the American colonies was whenever the British and French went to war, we were at war. We had nothing to do with that. We didn't particularly care, and lo and behold, Canada and the French and the Indians and all of a sudden were at war. And while the early American Republic was aggressive in terms of expansion across the continent, they had no interest in kind of wandering overseas. The famous John Quincy Adams admonition, don't go overseas looking for monsters to destroy. Be a well-wisher to the independence and the freedom of all. But be cautious when you wander out into that world and what you want to achieve. The Spanish-American War at the end of the 19th century really was the moment that took us overseas in a pretty dramatic way. And effectively, we acquired not only Cuba, but the Philippines. Of course, we had nothing in particular in common with the Philippines, but we wanted to be able to move towards China. We had to fight a long guerrilla war in the Philippines, and some of those issues remain with us. I mean, there was a Muslim insurgency that bedevils the current government down to the south. We had to deal with that, and we had a very bitter conflict there. It cost a couple of 100,000 Filipino lives and a fair number of our own. And that kind of launched the U.S. into what people typically called saltwater imperialism. But we still didn't have any interest in getting involved in all those crazy wars in Europe. I mean, the Europeans had a history of this, going back centuries. You look at the 19th century. I mean, Germany had 3 big wars in terms of unification. I mean, the early part with the Napoleonic Wars. I mean, Napoleon caused kind of the whole continent to be constantly at war for a number of years. And for the most part, we happily stayed out of all that mess. If those crazy people want to go killing each other, well, that's their business. But why on earth do we want to be part of that? And what really changed for us in terms of Europe was World War I. And this is where we had Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson, I mean, typically, in my view, because the left writes the history books, Woodrow Wilson is presented as this kind of wonderful liberal idealist. Now, this is a man who at home, wanted to make it illegal to criticize the president. This is a man who, during the war, have a free republic basically socialized the economy, extended federal control. And this is a man who basically wanted to remake the entire world. Social engineering is hard enough to do at home, but he had this grand vision of doing it all over. And of course, it was going to be the League of Nations. So we got involved in a crazy war in Europe where you wonder, why on earth do we have to get involved with Tsarist Russia and Wilhelmine Germany and the Austro-Hungarians and the Ottomans and the British and the French? What did we have at stake in that? Pretty hard to figure out how we were involved, except he wanted to remake the globe. And if you look at the Versailles Treaty, came out of that in 1919, you see how well that all worked out. He went off to Paris, and we're going to remake the globe, and isn't this wonderful, fabulous League of Nations? The League of Nations will keep the peace. And of course, a generation later, we were at war again. And I think World War II was truly, I think, the good war in the sense that we were attacked. The Germans declared war on us. And I would argue Nazi Germany was an extraordinarily serious threat. The tragedy, of course, out of that was we had the Soviet Union, and equally bad in its own set of ways, equally murderous, equally awful, equally aggressive. And it took, 40 years to defeat the Soviet Union. And I think one of the great credits for Ronald Reagan, of course, was the vision to see that communism could end. Reagan was one person who recognized that this was not some superhuman force. In contrast to many of the economists in the CIA, he recognized that this was not a place that was working well. It's extraordinary if you read some of the left-wing economists, Galbraith and Heilbrunner and some of these others, the Soviet Union was showing how it could work. They were achieving reasonable economic growth. And all you had to do was visit the place, and you'd see how it worked. You just see how they couldn't feed their own people. You see how the system worked. You walk down those streets. You understood that this was not a system that could keep up with the United States. I think it was Ronald Reagan's great vision, that ultimately liberty would win. And lo and behold, it did. The moment of, for those of us who are older, if you're in college today, the Cold War is not kind of your formative experience, but to see the Berlin Wall come down, to kind of have that historic year of 1989 where all of these dictatorships are swept away. But there's kind of an acceleration. And I can remember the exhilaration. It's Poland, it's Hungary, it's the Czech Republic, it's East Germany. All of these things are going, even Romania by the end of the year. Where Romanian soldiers all want to volunteer for the firing squad to take out the Ceausescu's. So eager to end that tyranny that I think really, is an extraordinary exclamation point for Ronald Reagan's vision. And the question is, what happens now? Because up till the end of the Cold War, the U.S. was not in a position where it could do whatever it wanted. Even during the Cold War, there were two kind of poles. That we had to be very concerned about what the Soviets were going to do. We had to worry about the Warsaw Pact. We had to be concerned about war in Europe. We had naval competitors around the world. And then that all disappeared. Colin Powell commented at the time, I'm running out of enemies. I'm down to Fidel Castro and Kim Il-sung. Now, both of those guys are nasty guys, but they are no match for Joseph Stalin, no match for Mao Zedong, no match for a big nation state, with lots of aircraft carriers and nuclear missiles and everything else. That essentially the real the threat of annihilation, that existential threat, suddenly disappeared. We were into a completely new world. And what we're finding today is that we've had about 20 years of that sense that we can do anything that we want. And I think that what we're finding today is that even the status of a unipower all of a sudden is being limited. It's not that anybody is able to hit us other than terrorism, but it's the problem is we suddenly find it's easier for people to deter us, people to kind of stop us, people to hold us off. I think, for example, of the issue of Libya. Now, you would think that the greatest military alliance in human history, NATO and the U.S., could get rid of some tin pot dictator in North Africa, but apparently not. Now, there's something very strange going on here. I happen to think the whole war is crazy. I don't really understand exactly what we're doing there, but I really don't understand why you go to war and then don't achieve anything. It's been over 2 months. We're really telling us that with a civil war going on there that the U.S. and the NATO allies can't do something? Instead, we kind of, every week you read where the British are really ratcheting up, they're going to send in a half dozen helicopters now. Oh, okay. And the French sent in 10 military advisors. Oh, great. This is the way you win a war. Now, I mean, I understand the Europeans doing that because they've been demobilizing and don't have a lot, but why are we doing that? I mean, if this is, the president gives these speeches and writes these articles about how vital this is, if this is really vital, what on earth are we doing? I don't know. But it gives a sense of some of the limitations we seem to be laboring under. We found, tragically, that in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, the best laid plans for nation building really get messed up by a few guys with AK-47s and IEDs. That it turns out it's a lot harder than people in Washington seem to think to achieve what we wanted. We had plans for Eastern Europe and expansion of NATO, and we suddenly found that when it comes to a country like Georgia, what Russia says really matters. That apparently there was some discussion in the Bush administration of whether or not we should bomb the tunnels the Russians were sending their troops through. And I remember reading that thinking, for Georgia, not our Georgia, but their Georgia, you want to confront a nuclear armed power on its border bombing their troops when we've gotten through the Cold War without killing each other? I mean, what on earth? And in my view, thankfully, good sense returned and people drew back from that. Because at the end of the day, they understood that we may be the unipower. The Russians can't take us on in any serious sense, but if we start bombing them, they do have nukes. And these are not people who are likely to sit around and say, oh, okay, whatever Washington says. Suddenly you're into a completely different world. You look at the questions of the Middle East, you look at North Korea, we suddenly found ourselves constrained in ways that are frustrating. After all, we want to tell these countries they can't build nuclear weapons, they can't do this, they can't do that, and we suddenly find they really don't care what we say. We lecture the Bahrainis about they should be nice to the majority Shia, and they don't really care, do they? I love it. We tell President Assad that he should be nice. And for some strange reason, his troops keep shooting protesters. Imagine that. I mean, we suddenly found a world in which there are these very important limitations. And I think it's important to, that while being the unipower, it turns out, is no longer quite what it was always seemed to be cracked up to be, we do pay a high price. And I think it's important, it's easy to think of the benefits of having this world-spanning role, but I think it's important to recognize the costs there, especially in the world we are financially and the other kind of costs. First is simply military spending. We have to recognize the military budget is the price of your foreign policy. I mean, the worst thing you can do is promise to do a lot of things and not have weapons to do it, not have force structure to do it. It's a horrible thing to do. It's horrible to do to your troops because they don't have the assets they need, they don't have the support they need, you put them at great risk. And it's bad for the country because you make promises and draw lines, and if you can't back them up, you lose credibility. So if you want to run the world, you better have a lot of forces. And if you want forces, they cost money. And what's expensive is not nuclear weapons. I mean, what's expensive are aircraft carriers and carrier groups. It's air wings, it's soldiers, it's Marine Corps. So you're going to have to spend a lot of money. So if you want to do everything around the world at a time when we're effectively bankrupt, realize you're going to have to spend the money. You can't get away from it. And what's extraordinary is if you look at the amount of money that we're spending. If you adjust in military spending for inflation, we spend roughly twice as much on the military today as we did in 2000. We spend roughly as much as the rest of the world combined on the military. If you look over time, we spend more in real terms than we did at any point during the Cold War, the Korean War, or the Vietnam War. We spend a lot of money. Now, you look around the world and you say, what's threatening us? Some people worry the Chinese want to deploy this kind of old, dilapidated carrier. That there was a carrier that the Russians were building, which they essentially gave to the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians sold it to the Chinese, and the Chinese are kind of fixing it up. So at some point, the Chinese will have a refurbished Ukrainian carrier that was abandoned by the Russians. Now, we have 11 carrier groups. I mean, who has the better Navy? I mean, we live in a world where America's Navy by tonnage is equal to that of the next 20 navies combined, 18 of which are allies. So you want to think about who threatens us in any conventional, normal sense. We have the best nuclear weapons on Earth. It's important to keep it that way. So I worry about some of the treaties and stuff. We want to make sure we keep that arsenal up to date so nobody else can ever be in a position to threaten us. But in terms of all the traditional measures of military power, we're way beyond anybody else. But it costs a lot to do that, and we have to ask, how much can we afford? We have a somewhere between 1.4 and 1.6 trillion dollar deficit this year, of which we're borrowing 40%. It's extraordinary. Who would have imagined kind of the wasteful fiscal policies? I mean, we've already have Basically, our Greece, I think, is probably California, and our Portugal may be Illinois. You start looking at states. I don't know, New York comes in and some of the others that have these crazy fiscal policies. But we're at risk of doing that nationally. And we can have the U.S. government bail out lots of people, but who bails out the U.S. government? So we have to ask that question, how do we make all of this stuff work? Especially when we start looking at entitlement spending. I mean, the combined unfunded liability, if you kind of do what the unlimited estimate, as they call it, for Medicare and Social Security is something like $100 trillion. I mean, that's promises made for which we have no cash, no funding in place, nothing. We have a $14 trillion national debt at the moment. Even the responsible, Obama budget given to us last February has $10 trillion more in debt over the next decade. I mean, this onrush of red ink. So that fiscal cost matters. What are we prepared to spend money on? What can we afford? The second is the risk of war. We have to recognize you want to do a lot of stuff in the world. Well, you take risks. And the problem with alliances, we hope alliances will always deter conflict, and they often do. But all you have to do is look throughout history and you find lots of wars that occurred despite alliances. In fact, where alliances act not as fire breaks to war, but rather they act as transmission belts of war. I mean, the famous, I think, best example may be World War I. So, the Archduke of Austro-Hungary gets murdered in Sarajevo, at that time Bosnia, a province essentially of Austro-Hungary. Who on earth cares? Well, 2 or 3 months later, most of the known world is at war. 20 million people are dead 4 years later. Suddenly you get carried in. The other thing that alliances do is they tend to change behavior of your friends. The country of Georgia really started the war with the Russians. Now, the Russians may have set a trap, it wouldn't surprise me. But the people who started shooting were actually the Georgians. And there's a lot of evidence they thought the U.S. would back them up. I mean, if you think the superpower is behind you, you suddenly change your behavior. So suddenly this becomes a riskier world because your allies figure you're going to take care of things. That's clearly what's happened on Libya. I mean, I love the French and the British want to go to war, and then they don't understand when Obama says, okay, now it's your war. And they're like, well, wait a minute. We don't have the force for this. And it's like, well, you guys wanted the war, go fight it. But, my goodness, they were relying on us. I mean, so you get this kind of behavior that, you're likely to find yourself at war more often if you start drawing these lines. We also have to be concerned about lives. We've lost about 4,500 soldiers, Marines, and others in Iraq, around 1,500 in Afghanistan. And we've been very lucky. I mean, the good news in this war is that we have much better medical technology, and we're able to save a lot of lives that in Vietnam would have died. Of course, the bad news is we have a lot more very severe injuries. So we have a lot of people out there who've been maimed while defending and acting heroically. And they will suffer from those injuries for the rest of their lives. So this is something we want to be very careful and think about when we put people at risk. I mean, my father was career Air Force. My former brother-in-law was career Air Force. My nephew, God bless him, like a month ago graduated from SEAL training. I went out to San Diego and sat there both immensely proud and immensely nervous. He's learning Filipino, so my hope is, well, maybe he won't go to Afghanistan. Maybe he'll end up fighting the Moro guerrillas or something down in the Philippines. But we have to recognize that, they're, the tip of the spear, that's where the casualties really come out. And there's also, we want to recognize costs to those when we start wars. I've always been frustrated at the notion of war as kind of a humanitarian exercise. Because, in Iraq, I mean, Saddam Hussein was a really nasty guy, and I'm glad he's gone. But by going in, we blew the country up. Probably the best estimate of civilian casualties is at least 200,000 dead Iraqis. The Christian community there has been devastated. At least half of it has been driven out of Iraq. Many of those people are very nervous now because they went to Syria. Because it turns out secular dictators don't particularly care and don't persecute. And they are scared to death that if they get a democratic Syria, they will have the experience that the Coptic Church is having in Egypt, which is the new democracy or emerging democracy in Egypt doesn't care very much about religious freedom. And the Copts there, I think, are very vulnerable. Christians who've gone to Syria are equally nervous. But there are human consequences of starting some of these conflicts that we want to think very carefully on. That if we're going to be out there presenting these as humanitarian exercises, we want to bear in mind that sometimes unintended consequences happen. And those are not only for our own personnel, but they can be for the people that we want to do better for. And there's also, I think, the issue of terrorism. Now, it's a very complex question of why people hate us, but I would argue that we have to recognize there are consequences of actions. The simple thing is you cannot wander around the globe bombing, invading, and occupying countries and not have people angry and trying to kill you. Doesn't mean you may not find policies worthwhile and be willing to accept the cost, but recognize there's a cost. I mean, I think Ronald Reagan's greatest mistake was getting involved in Lebanon. Now, it was a civil war that had been going on for more than a decade, involved 25 different armed parties. We got involved and supported the kind of minority Christian government that basically governed Beirut, not much more. You can go back at the time, pick up newspaper articles, and the USS New Jersey was offshore bombarding Druze villages. We should not be surprised when people struck the Marine Corps barracks and the embassy. Now, nothing justifies terrorism, but we have to recognize if we're going to intervene in other people's messes, we're going to make enemies. And that's a consequence we have to be prepared for. So I think what we want to do then is say, you know, being dominant, maintaining this dominance is expensive. Is it worth doing in the future? And the question is why? Do we need this kind of a foreign policy where we're involved everywhere? And what I would say is that what we have to do is start paring back. My principle number one would be we don't have to protect rich allies. I don't know why on earth we still have troops in Europe. I don't get it. And I'll be quite honest, I don't care about the Balkans. I don't care what happens in Bosnia. I don't care what happens in Kosovo. That's Europe's problem. Europe has collectively a bigger GDP and a bigger population than us. Let them take care of it. Why do we have to try to create a nation state in Kosovo and protect it and move it forward and keep troops there? This really is a European problem. Isn't it time, 65 years after the end, or 66 years, I guess, after the end of World War II, to tell the Europeans, guys, time to grow up. And if you all want a war in Libya, go to it, but don't come calling to us. You know, Libya is closer to you. You have commercial ties. You're worried about immigration. You're worried about refugees. All of that is fine, but please do it yourself. Don't expect us to bail you out. Same thing I would argue in both Japan and South Korea. Now, there's a lot of issues in terms of culture and history coming out of the war, but again, my reaction is 66 years later, you know, if you have, at least till last year, the second largest economy on earth and you're Japan, we shouldn't have to defend you from the Chinese. You should be defending yourselves from the Chinese. South Korea has 40 times the GDP of North Korea, twice the population, and they spent the last 10 years shipping money and food to North Korea, who they claim to fear. Now, I don't get that. I mean, if you have a much bigger economy, you're much more stronger in every measure of power, and you're subsidizing your enemy, and you want us to defend you. Well, hey guys, I'm sorry. We're bankrupt. We have other things going on. We have a couple of wars we're fighting. Maybe it's time you took care of the problem. Now, I've been to South Korea many times. I have friends there. I've gone to Easter services there. But my friends there can never give me a good explanation why we have to stay. They're kind of horrified at the thought they might have to spend more on the military. And I say, welcome to the club. Yeah, gee, it's tragic, isn't it? You have to take resources away from other things and spend it on your own defense. Guess what, guys? Time for you to do that. And we could save a lot that way. I think what we have to say is, look, we want to be concerned about the world. We want to be prepared to back up allies if they face great threats. But when it comes down to a potential threat like China, I want the people doing the most work to be those who are in the neighborhood most threatened. I don't want us to be the guys who have to decide who owns the Paracel Islands, who is involved in fighting over the Spratly Islands, these sorts of things. That's for Japan, it's for the Philippines, the ASEAN countries, Australia, the Koreas. You know, we need to expect our allies to do a lot more. I think we also have to ask questions about nation building. Now, I went to Afghanistan last year, spent 10 days there, and I don't know really what we're doing. I mean, the good news is Osama bin Laden's dead, and Al-Qaeda's not there anymore. Al-Qaeda's next door in our ally, Pakistan, you know, which over the years has supported the Taliban and has been very unhelpful in many ways in terms of what's going on in Afghanistan. We are, as far as I can tell, trying to create a Western-style liberal democracy and central government in Afghanistan. Now, after more than a decade, Kabul is a fortified city. They buy barbed wire by the mile. I mean, I stayed at a little British lodge. You couldn't see it from the side of the road. It was behind two walls. And I mean, in the big compounds, you go down, there's a theoretically open street. You go down where the embassy and the USAID are on opposite sides. You can't see them from the street. Huge walls. I mean, this is after 10 or 11 years. And my question is, why are we doing this? It's tragic what's happening there. They're good people who want a free society, but are we going to be able to bring it to them, and is that something we have to try to do? Our job was to get rid of al-Qaeda. Our job was to throw out the guys who were host to al-Qaeda. Do we need to be there 11 years on trying to recreate and keep a government going and remake it? So I think we should be very skeptical at the notion that we can engage in basically social engineering around the world. It's hard enough here. I think conservatives are typically understand how hard it is in America. In contrast to the lefties, who all think you can just kind of remake a new man and everything's great. We understand how difficult it is to reach in and transform people, families, and communities. Imagine doing that overseas where you're reaching past tradition, history, religion. I mean, you think of religion, Mazar, a city to the north, relatively peaceful. We spent several days there, didn't feel threatened, wandered around pretty much openly. Earlier this year, there was a riot that killed several UN workers because of the burning of the Quran in Gainesville, Florida. And when I was on a show with somebody from Kabul who was kind of a high official. He said, oh, that's not a big deal, you see. I mean, they just hate all the foreigners who are infidels. They did that to the Russians. And I thought, and I'm supposed to feel good about that? I mean, I went to a city that was supposed to be safe last year, and it turns out this year they're quite happy to murder people, not because of anything the people did, but because of some idiot, off in Florida who did something, and that's an excuse to murder people? I mean, this is the kind of thing that we're dealing with. So I think we want to be very skeptical about that. What we want to do is be the most important, the most powerful nation on earth. We want to protect ourselves. But we don't want to be involved in every dispute, every mess that's out there. So I'd suggest a foreign policy, not isolationism. I mean, I'm one who believes in trade. I want America involved in the world. I personally love to travel. I think America wants to be engaged, but thoughtful engagement, careful engagement, responsible engagement, not engagement that requires us to do everything. I mean, you look at a place like Libya, of course, not only do we have to remake the regime through military means, and of course we're going to be expected to fund everything. And I love all the advocates of foreign aid today. It's as if we have nothing else going on. We're borrowing 40% of every dollar, but we're told, well, we have to be responsible not only for the war, we have to be responsible for the peace and all the money. I mean, is there no end? That we are not the only people in the world today. And I think the conservatives, should need to think this issue over very importantly. That we want to be a constitutional republic. We want our domestic policy to reflect that. It's very hard to maintain kind of a constitutional republic if you're going to try to maintain an overseas presence that's so incredibly dominant, so powerful, and so expensive. And I'm afraid that's where we are today. That we're facing national bankruptcy. And I would argue most of what we're doing today, it's subsidizing rich allies and trying to remake failed societies. Let's protect America. Let's not engage in social engineering overseas, and certainly let's not subsidize a whole set of welfare queens from other countries who prefer to spend their money on their own things while we bear the burden for everyone else. Ultimately, I go back to John Quincy Adams' admonition. We should be the well-wisher, the freedom and independence of all, but we shouldn't go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. Let's make very clear, if you attack us, you're dead. Absolutely. But it's not going to be our purpose to search out all the bad guys around the planet and fix all the problems around the planet. I'll close there, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
I'm sure. Whoa, 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 look at all those things. Howie?
Regarding searching out enemies across the planet, you touched on Iran a little bit, but could you explain a little bit more? They said if and when they get the nuke, they'll take out Israel. Do we just stand by and watch that happen? I hope not.
Well, see, I actually don't think that's likely to happen. The good news is, number one, Ahmadinejad doesn't run anything. I mean, the system in Iran is kind of like the Soviet system. There's kind of a nominal president, which is Ahmadinejad, and then there's the guys who really run the system. So instead of being Communist Party, they're the mullahs. He's been going through this embarrassing situation recently. He tried to fire the oil minister, and the Khomeini, the supreme leader, said, no, you can't, and that's the end of it. Everything I've seen in Iran's behavior is that these people are shamefully self-interested. People like Rafsanjani is a billionaire. I mean, he's one of the players, or he's kind of on the outs, but he's a former president, one of the mullahs. I don't see, when they had the big conflict with Iraq, they had human wave tactics. I didn't see the leadership leading the human wave tactics. I saw them sending other people out to do that. I actually think that, I mean, Israel has between 150 and 200 nukes, so I'm actually not particularly concerned. I think Israel will nuke them. I mean, they know that. I mean, they know that they would be destroyed. When I was in Israel last August, I talked to security journalists who they were personally convinced that Iran would not use nuclear weapons. Their feeling was this is a political, I mean, the nuclear weapons program in Iran actually started under the Shah. This is not a new thing. It's actually not a Muslim bomb, it's an Iranian bomb. Now, there's good reason to be nervous about that. I'd prefer that they not have it. The problem is we have no good options. It's not clear we know where all the facilities are. It's not clear that we can get them all. And a military strike would, I think, set off huge problems. So Iran is one of those real difficult situations. I worry less about the North Koreans because it's quite clear that Kim Jong-il, wants his virgins in this world, not the next. So I have no doubt that he's not looking for any suicide missions. But, I mean, on Iran, I'm uncomfortable. But I actually think that the good news there, I really think that Israel has the ultimate deterrent there. The worrisome thing in talking with the journalists was they're not convinced that any Israeli prime minister could feel a willingness to stand by if it looked like Iran was getting to nuclear weapons, at which point they might strike, and it's not clear they have the assets to do it. They can strike once, but they can't do follow-on, basically. And then, a partial strike would be the worst of everything. I mean, you get all the bad consequences without actually achieving, ending or at least delaying the program. I think Iran's one of those horrible problems where there is no good answer in any way that I can see.
Could you just talk a little bit about China? I know they've been sinking a whole lot of money into not only cyber warfare, but mobile missile defenses and submarine buildup, and also that Pakistan is allying more closely with China. So could you talk about that? And a second question, if I may, is do you think that the foreign policy distractions will successfully distract the American voter from the failures of the Obama domestic policies?
Let me take the second first, which is I don't think that, in fact, that's going to happen. I mean, the American people seem far more concerned about economics, jobs, growth. I just don't see that changing. I mean, through thick and thin over the last couple of years, they've emphasized that it doesn't matter what smoke and mirrors the administration has tried. Great legislative triumphs like the health care bill. American people still don't like it. Majority of people still want to get rid of it. I think that this is going to be I don't see how anything good, I suppose if he starts a war with somebody at the very right moment and everybody rallies around the flag, but I don't think that, I'm not too worried. I think that the American people have seen through this administration and understand, how important these issues are. To some degree, the Chinese-Pakistan connection reflects the fact that we're now friendlier with India. During the Cold War, it was kind of India, the Soviet Union versus America, Pakistan. So these are weakening. The problem on Pakistan is some of us call it a frenemy. It's nominally, a friend, but boy, not very friendly behavior. You look at those personal attitudes, they're awful. I do a lot of work on religious persecution. They just, murdered a Christian who was the kind of religious minorities federal minister, and they also murdered a liberal Muslim who was a governor who had spoken out against the blasphemy laws, which basically are routinely used against Christians. I'm a Muslim, I'm mad at you, I accuse you of committing blasphemy, and you end up in jail. Those people were murdered, and there were demonstrations applauding. And not just crazy people, like the Pakistani Lawyers Association were holding prayers for the murderers. Pakistan is a real mess. That's a place, when I think of nuclear weapons, they're the ones I worry about. They have 80, 90, 100 nuclear weapons. If that place blows apart, who knows where that stuff goes. In terms of China, what I'd say is turn around the world and imagine if we were in China's place. A foreign power which had proved itself to be very interventionist, that had the most powerful military on earth, was routinely sailing off the east and west coast and into the Gulf of Mexico, and was occasionally issuing threats saying, we know you're upset about Cuba, but if you do anything in Cuba, we're going to bomb you. What would we do? We would build up a deterrent force. And that's essentially what's happening to China. I don't know, the Chinese government's awful. It's a crazy communism. It's capitalist during the Communist Party. what you've got there, I think, is more fascism. It's a nasty, thuggish government on a somewhat freer economy, and it faces a lot of problems. I don't view them as giants. This remains a very poor country. The best per capita income, depending on the measure you use, is somewhere between 4,000 and 7,000. It's a very poor country. It's got a big GDP because it's got a lot of people. Its banking system is a mess. It's got its own property, kind of explosion and bubble. I mean, there are a lot of things that can go wrong there. So this is not, we shouldn't look at these people, oh, this is terrible, 5 years are going to be more powerful than us. Long ways away. Now, in the military, the best estimate of what they spend is somewhere between 100, 150 billion. I mean, these are funny numbers because they don't put it all in their budget and you're trying to cost things out. We spend 700 billion. I mean, like I said, they're bringing one aircraft carrier online, which is an old variant that had been tossed by the Russians, and we have 11 carrier groups of the best carriers on Earth. It just gives a sense. What they want to do is deter us. And they understand deterrence is a lot cheaper than offense. They have no ability to take America on. They have no ability to send a conquest force to Hawaii. What they can do is make it very expensive for us to get between them and Taiwan or play kind of in their neighborhood. You do three things. One is you strengthen your nukes so we can't kind of coerce them that way, can't threaten them that way. Second is you build up the ability to sink American carriers, so you get missiles in particular and subs. And third is you look for asymmetric warfare. Information systems, shoot down our satellites, blind us, that sort of thing. So what we're faced with a world in which Pentagon puts out an annual report on Chinese military spending. The way they put it is, access denial. The kind of that it's basically preventing us access to the South China Sea, preventing us access. We have to decide how much that's worth, because to overcome them just buying missiles. I mean, one of the biggest threats is missiles. How do you defend against the missiles and you're prepared to lose carriers? And that's, I think, the world we're dealing with. Again, they are in no position to threaten us, and it's hard to imagine when they would be. And we're talking decades, I think. It's certainly years, if not decades. I mean, they're way behind. But they can make a cost very, very high for us getting involved in Asia. And that's one of the things we're going to have to think about. How much do we want? And that's why I say I want the Japanese to build stuff. And the Australians actually have a big kind of armament plan that they're in the midst of, which I think is very good. Remember that almost all the ASEAN countries, the Southeast Asian countries, are building submarines largely in response to China. And I say that's great. Because just as they're trying to deter us, I want our friends in the region to be deterring them. I want them to understand that doing stupid things is cost. I have a piece up on American Spectator Online this morning talking about why it's very important that we sell arms to Taiwan. They want new F-15s, upgraded F-15s. They want subs. I say we should sell them. And I don't care if the Chinese are upset, and they will be. We want to make sure that our friends in Taiwan have a capacity to impose a very high cost on the Chinese if the Chinese are really stupid and try something. So I think that we need to kind of use that same strategy back.
You mentioned trade is something we should promote. We have 3 agreements, and I was involved in negotiating 2 of them, that have been pending forever, and a series of crazy steps by Obama where it's always a half an inch forward and 5 miles back on whether they'll ever even send them to the Congress. 2 prongs. One, what is really in it for labor? And 2, can anybody in this administration ever stand up to them? I mean, Hillary's sitting there telling the foreign minister of Colombia yesterday that I am certain this will pass. Well, it can't pass unless you send it up.
No, I mean, I think, look, I mean, conservatives at times are divided on trade. I think America is the most productive, most powerful power on the planet. We don't have to fear anybody. And I think the trade is good for us. And it also plays into geopolitical issues. I mean, my view, Colombia, I mean, we want them to defeat both FARC, the communist guerrillas, and the drug lords, and we don't want to have a better trade arrangement with them. I mean, South Korea, we're worried about Chinese penetration throughout East Asia, and we're not having a trade agreement with South Korea. Today, the Chinese trade more with South Korea than we do. And the South Koreans have, kind of have an agreement that's coming into force July 1 with the European Union. So the Europeans are going to have an advantage on us. But we've been sitting around, and you're right. I mean, I think American labor is backward thinking. I mean, instead of thinking America is a productive, powerful place where they can take advantage of entrepreneurship and sell to the world, they're scared to death that somebody might show up and take one job away from something they're doing. And the problem is is the pie, and I think conservatives talk about this a lot, is the pie fixed or is the pie expanding? And I believe it's expanding. And the point is we all do better. Let's expand it. Let's focus on expanding it. Unfortunately, well, the president, I think, and the Democrats in the Congress and labor are all of the notion it's fixed. And it's a question of how much you can scrape away. You know, the rich people need to pay more or something, scrape a little bit extra. And that's unfortunately what's motivating them. We just have to, you know, kind of push them on it and hope that within the Democratic Party and within, you know, there are enough kind of business and corporate and other elements that might be able to push enough of them to get those forward. But you're right, it's very disappointing. And I think we're losing ground and we're not helping countries that we should want to help. I mean, it's crazy policy. Exactly. Yes, of course. Absolutely.
Next question, that lady there.
Will you run for president? Please?
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Raise the money for me, I will.
Mexico. We have a vital interest in Mexico. Obviously, it shares our southern border. Things are bad there now, and they're only getting worse. Most of our real threats to the continental U.S. have always come from our borders, either the War of 1812 with Canada, or we've seen Mexico, of course, or the Mexican-American War during the before World War I. How do you see that future going? How do you see it possibly getting better? And would nation building in Mexico actually be worthwhile?
Well, I suppose one of the questions of nation building is, well, if you think you can do it, it might be worthwhile, but I don't know exactly what that means in Mexico. I mean, you know, remember, I mean, there's a long history there, and the Mexicans don't necessarily like that history. I mean, we stole half their country back in 1840. I guess 1848 was the treaty was finally signed. You know, there's an old saying that, you know, so pity Mexico, so far from God, so close to the United States. So the notion that we can kind of show up there and help them, you know, well, in fact, maybe we could. It's not at all clear they want our help. And I think the issue of drugs is one of those problems. Look, the reality is you have hundreds of billions of dollars flowing into illegal enterprises, and you have a fragile, incompetent, corrupt nation state. You got real problems. And it took a lot of work. Colombia, I mean, it took a huge amount of effort, but they got through it. I mean, my pastor's son just went down to the soccer team from Messiah College to Medellin and did missionary work. Well, I mean, 20 years ago, you would never have gone to Medellin. I mean, that was the center of the Medellin cartel, the most violent cartel in Colombia. Now you can go down there and have college kids go wandering around and doing good things. So some of the problem with that is that typically places get better and worse, but it changes. I mean, it's getting worse in Peru. Peru had been real bad. It got better. Now there's some. So I think, you know, over time, Mexico may get a better handle on it, but it's real tough. I mean, there are as many armed guys in the gangs as there are in terms of you know, the Mexican military, and they can buy off Mexican military commanders just like they buy off the police. And of course, the Mexicans say you've got to stop like selling guns, as if, you know, you can produce masses of drugs and get them across the border and they couldn't get guns. I mean, it's the most kind of ridiculous thing. So I would say we do have an interest there in trying, I mean, both in immigration, illicit immigration, and also in drugs and kind of the gang warfare. That's a real hard one, because we can try to help them and improve their capabilities, but as long as you have the kind of drug market that we do, as long as it's an illegal drug market, the money that goes in is going to be huge. It's going to overwhelm a society like that. And it's hard to, you know, kind of really seal up the border. I mean, that's the challenge we're facing. So a prosperous, competent, efficient, honest government, you know, in Mexico would be very helpful to us. And I'm not sure exactly, I mean, I'd like to see us try to get there, but it's not easy to get there. So there are real limitations. But you're right, that's a serious issue for us.
Could you comment on the Islamification of Europe and Londonistan?
Yeah, I mean, the good news for us is that many of our Arabs are Christians. I mean, that, you know, number one, we do better at assimilation, but the other thing is that many of our Arabs actually are Christians. I mean, last August I was in Israel. I also went into the West Bank and met with Arab Christians, Palestinian Christians. The one who organized the trip actually grew up in San Diego. His father is Palestinian, his mother's American, and he grew up over here. You know, so we have a different kind of issue. We have, you know, some elements of that. I think the real problem for us is more Saudi money subsidizing some of the radical madrasas and, you know, mosque, which is an extraordinary problem because, I mean, again, our allies are our worst enemies. I mean, it should be very clear to us. Countries like Pakistan and Saudi Arabia are the real problems. The people who are I mean, I know what North Korea is about. And I think we can deal with them. You know, you guys screw with us and we blow you up. Okay, thank you, we're done. I mean, it's fairly simple to come up with an arrangement there. But how do you deal with, you know, these other countries, which are actually out there actively subsidizing all the wrong stuff? Europe has a bigger problem. It's the colonial experience. It's both France and Britain particularly, but now because of the EU free movement, is where you have all these colonies and you don't let people, I mean, the French had this long relationship with Algeria. Well, guess what? Everybody shows up. I mean, Britain had a lot of Pakistanis in particular, but also Indians. I mean, there's a large Muslim population there. And they don't really assimilate. I mean, they kind of have their own cloistered community. And that's led to the question of France banning the burqa. It's led to, I mean, in Britain, it's kind of gone the other way and allowing a lot of crazy stuff. I think, I don't expect, I mean, I think it's probably overblown to say that, they're going to be outbirthed and, in 20 years there won't be a Europe left. Nevertheless, I think they face some very real issues, and the political correctness is extraordinary. I mean, you see that what's happened to somebody like Geert Wilders, who simply wants to talk about some of the worst passages in the Quran, and he's vilified and brought up on hate crimes charges. I mean, I think it shows the problem that what you see is an unwillingness to address some very fundamental issues. And that's one area where I think we can be very thankful for the First Amendment, despite some of the weirdnesses the courts give that at times. You look at the hate crimes legislation, you look at the persecution of people who want to talk about basic issues. And it doesn't matter whether or not you think they're right. I mean, if you're in a place where you are afraid to point at things like this, of what does that do to your society? What's the long-term impact? You've got extraordinary problems. I mean, you're not even willing to defend your freedom in that way. I don't trust them to defend their freedom if they really have to, when the crunch comes where it's, I don't know, a 40% Islamic population or whatever we could imagine in the future. So that's, I think, there are some signs of revival. I mean, some signs of people responding against that, and Wilders is one of those, where he's done very well in Parliament. He's kind of a silent backer of the government, that they're starting to have to treat these people seriously. And you see that in Belgium and some other places where greater nervousness, we invite these people over and they busily murder our people. Not a good thing. Maybe we'll see a backlash there, and I hope in the coming years that somebody will stand up.
Two more questions. In the back.
Hi, good morning. I'm French, as you can hear, maybe. Just a question concerning nation building. When you said about Afghanistan, don't you think that because the US left Afghanistan very quickly in the early 90s, the Taliban managed to come to power in the mid-90s? And are you not afraid that if Americans and the allies leave pretty quickly Afghanistan the next years, the Taliban will come back, or a power like the Taliban will come back, and Al-Qaeda and so on?
Well, there are kind of two elements to that question. The first is, and I've heard a lot, is that we left too quickly and didn't kind of fix the place. And I have no idea on earth what that meant. We gave weapons to the Mujahideen to kill Soviets. They killed Soviets and the Soviets left. So then what on earth were we supposed to do? Show up in Kabul and say, we're going to teach you Afghans how to make a government? We're here to kind of have a good relationship with you Mujahideen after you all killed the Soviets. I mean, I hear that and I just don't, I mean, it doesn't strike me that there's anything that the West, the U.S. could have done. Now, I think U.S. policy was flawed not by supporting the Mujahideen and killing Soviets. I think that winning the Cold War was a very important thing. And drawing the Soviets into that and kind of getting them killed off was very useful for that purpose. But we gave the money to the Pakistanis who funded the worst groups. That, I mean, there were kind of fairly secular and moderate folks who we tended not to support, and the bad guys got most of the money. But I just don't know what we could have done. I mean, I look back at that time, the Soviets draw out, and what would we have done? Sent in, a World Bank mission, had the IMF show up and suggest a currency reform program, set up a USAID mission, funded a few schools. I mean, we're trying to do that now, but the problem was, I mean, you had warring Mujahideen who kicked the Soviets out and then they killed each other. And understandably, the Afghans said, enough of this, give us somebody who'll maintain peace and order, and which is the Taliban rose. This is a place that went through, I mean, horror. Where, they're relatively stable under the king. There's a coup d'etat. The Soviets come in. I mean, all this. So I'm not convinced we could have done a lot. I don't know what happens in the future. I mean, my hope is that what you find is a fracturing of the country. The Taliban of their sort probably runs Pashtun areas. You might very well find a nominal government in charge in Kabul, and then other areas like Mazar, which I mentioned, is Tajik. To the west, Herat and others. I mean, you have different ethnic groups. I think the good news is that the Taliban seems to have felt burned by Al-Qaeda. You invite this guy in, Pashtun hospitality, and what does this guy do? He attacks the United States, and now suddenly you're out of power. And I think that to me, that's the most important thing that we demonstrated. It was, look, guys, you bring people into your territory and they attack us, and you're gone. And I think that warning would carry over. And in fact, you could say that. Look, You know, whether or not people can fly kites, that's not our problem. But boy, if you play, footsie with the Al-Qaeda again, and I mean, the problem for us is Al-Qaeda has found plenty of other places to operate. The national organization isn't nearly as important as the kind of smaller groups. Yemen is a major problem. That country is in crisis. The government's probably going to go under. Al-Qaeda plays a very important role. Whatever comes out of that may be strengthening of Al-Qaeda. I think they're probably much more problematic these days than Afghanistan. So in fact, I don't think Afghanistan matters much for Al-Qaeda in the future. I'd love to see a positive outcome in Afghanistan. I met very good people who want to live in the kind of society we live in. I just don't know how we give it to them and give it to them in a way and over a time frame that's realistic and at an expense that's realistic.
Last question.
5 minutes from my house, there's an Islamic cultural center with all the shades drawn. They tore down a 2-story building to build a 5-story building. It's a buzz of activity. The police have been watching it, they said, for years. The permit to build the building is the Saudi government. They have 2 madrasas in Fairfax County, where we live, and no one is saying anything. What can we do here at home to prevent this spread of cancer?
Well, this is one of those areas where I start losing a bit of my libertarian sensibilities. I mean, when it comes to the Saudi government, I think we have to be very careful how we treat religious organizations, how we restrict construction of, mosques and other sorts of stuff. But I don't feel nearly as bad saying, we really don't want the Saudi government sending cash in. I mean, they won't allow Christians to worship in Saudi Arabia, so we're certainly not allowed to send money to, even if we were inclined to, which of course we wouldn't, we could never write a check to a Christian congregation in Riyadh because there is none. But they can send money, and I wouldn't mind if it was purely for cultural activities. But we all know that the Saudis are supporting the worst Wahhabist. And this to me, this is the real issue. It's not a question of Islam. Islam. I think the fundamental theology there is problematic in terms of what the Quran says. The good news, I think, is that many, if not most, Muslims don't particularly. They're kind of, like, Christmas, Easter Christians. You kind of like, oh yes, I'm a Muslim, and you don't pay attention to, when Muhammad told them to kill the infidels or whatever. The problem is what we see is the Saudis are promoting the worst sort of teachings, and that's where you see that in Pakistan, you see that elsewhere. We can't control what goes on in Pakistan. We certainly should be able to control what goes on here. And I think that is a very real issue for us. That just as you get concerned about you let communists kind of propagate and whatever who want to destroy your society. Well, do you want to let the Saudis underwrite people whose fundamental values and are antithetical to our system? I think that's something that we need to address.
Thank you. Thank you very much. What an interesting, very compelling presentation. There are 2 things that I want to present to you. First is the watch that you left here. But then I'm going to present you a copy. This is the newest edition of the Leadership Institute's Adam Smith ties, which I know are worn at Cato. So thank you so much. I wore those
back in the Reagan administration, so thank you very much.
Indeed, they were. I wore them every day at the Reagan White House. Ed Meese wore them every day. Many others did. And after a time, there were content-free Republicans in the Reagan administration who were wearing Adam Smith ties for protective coloration. I invite you all to join us on Wednesday, July 6th. For our next Wednesday Wake Up Club breakfast. Our guest speaker then will be Al Cardenas, who is the new chairman of the American Conservative Union. I'd invite anyone interested in a tour of the Institute and our new addition next door to meet with Seth Nichols at the podium after breakfast. Here is Seth. He will do that, and when he takes you up to the 5th floor, he can take you by my assistant, Kathy Graham, who will be happy to sell you Adam Smith ties, scarves, and other such merchandise. Thank you all very much.